Hello, and welcome to Western Civ. In today's bonus author interview, I sit down with historian Justine Firnhaber-Baker. I talk about her most recent book, which is House of Lilies, the Dynasty that made medieval France. Now, I'm sure you're well aware of this, but I love medieval history, and I very much enjoyed the book and the opportunity to sit down with Justine and talk about the Capetian dynasty that's going to rule what's going to become France, starting in about 987 of the Common Era. This is such an interesting period in European history because you get it all. You get the Norman conquest of England. You get the start of the Crusades. This is the high feudal period. This is the birth of chivalry as a concept. And as we talk about, you even get such fun and novel ideas as the peace and truce of God, which I just can never stop talking about for whatever reason. It's a wonderful book. We had a lovely, almost an hour chat about it, but there's obviously much more to the book than we get into. So if you know anyone who's interested in medieval history, medieval France in particular, or maybe you just want to brush up on your French history in advance of the Summer Olympic Games, scheduled to start in Paris in about 2 months. If you're listening to this as it comes out, pick up the book. The link is in the show notes. It comes out today. It is available for purchase. And with that, let's get to the interview. And welcome back. As I mentioned just moments ago, I'm on the phone right now with historian Justine Firnhaber-Baker, and we're going to be talking about the House of Lilies, the dynasty that made medieval France. Well, if anybody who is familiar with the show knows, I love medieval history, and this is a particularly interesting period, I think, in the development of especially Western Europe, and I think we're going to get into a lot of that. But, for those who don't know what the heck I'm talking about when I'm talking about the medieval dynasty that makes sort of modern France, we're going to be talking about the Capetians today. So we're going to be talking about the end of the 10th century and onward, because that's kind of where we're at. So I wanted to start in the beginning. The Capetian dynasty begins with Hugh Capet in 987 of the Common Era. And I'm wondering if you could give our listeners a sense of the kind of kingdom he was going to have to lead, and he was elected to lead. And I mean this on several levels: geographically, socially, political, economic, because what I think we have to do right away is set aside our notions of what France is today compared to the kingdom that he was taking over in 987.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really great place to start. And that is, I think, a really important thing for people who are coming to the Capetians and to medieval France to know right off the bat. This kingdom is a forerunner of modern France, and in some ways a forerunner even of what we think of as medieval France. And there are similarities, there are also differences. One thing that's different right off the bat is that this kingdom at that time is actually known as West Francia rather than France. And it is a division of the old Carolingian Empire founded by Charlemagne, who was crowned Western Emperor on Christmas Day 800, and who assembled this enormous empire that covered most of Western Europe, running from Spain to Eastern Germany and down into Italy. But Charlemagne's grandsons fought over the empire, and in 843, they came to an agreement that split the empire in three. So one of those grandsons took the eastern part, known as East Francia. One, the youngest, a man named Charles the Bald, took the western part, which is West Francia, Hugh Capet's kingdom, and the kingdom that is going to develop into what we know of as France. And then there was this middle kingdom that was literally called the Middle Kingdom, and which ends up being absorbed into East Francia very quickly. But that Carolingian origin for West Francia, which will become France, is still very much alive. That's very much how people are thinking about this territory in 987 when Hugh Capet comes to the throne, and we'll talk more about that. In terms of its geographic scope, it's actually probably a little bit bigger than modern France is today. So it doesn't include Provence, but it does include Flanders and what is now Belgium, and it also includes Catalonia. So it is this massive chunk of territory. But in terms politically of what the king actually has control over, there are two ways in which his power is kind of limited. One is from above, because, as I said, this is sort of a division of the Carolingian Empire, and the Carolingian successors to that imperial title, a family called the Ottonians, are still very much thinking of West Francia as kind of a client state. Now, the West Frankish kings don't like that, but the Ottonians do have kind of a claim there. The other, that claim will disappear very quickly, actually, because the Ottonians disappear very quickly. But in Hugh Capet's day, it's a live issue, and actually part of why he comes to the throne, as we might talk about later. But the other issue, which is much more important and will have much more long-term effects, is that politically the kingdom is divided into big lordships, these big duchies, the Duchy of Aquitaine, the Duchy of Normandy. That's going to have a big future importance for the Capetians, which we'll come back to. And those dukes just kind of do what they want. So the king is their superior, and they recognize that, but the king does not really interfere in their affairs without invitation. And actually, what tends to happen is they tend to make alliances and try to keep power in balance, but that means that they're going to war a lot of the time. So I wouldn't say it's a hugely unstable situation. It's just kind of how power worked at the time. But it's very different to say how power works like under an absolutist monarch in the 17th or 18th centuries. In terms of economy and society, this is a really interesting moment. So at this point, the kingdom that becomes France is, like most of medieval Europe, almost totally agrarian, right? So almost everybody is working the land. And most of those people are actually unfree. They're serfs, which isn't the same thing as slavery, but it does mean that there are a lot of things that they can't do. Like they can't just move at will, and they owe their lord service, and they owe him money, and they can't just marry whoever they want. There are some towns. They are still small. They are few and relatively far between, but they are important, and they are increasing in importance. And actually, the Capetians come to the throne at an excellent moment economically, because this is the beginning of a real economic takeoff in European history for a couple of reasons, one of which is climate change, actually. We're at the beginning of a period that we refer to as the medieval climatic anomaly, or the medieval warm period, when the growing season was a little bit longer. It's just that little bit warmer, and temperatures and rainfall are stable. So that really helps in terms of crop yields. It's also when we start to see the introduction of the heavy plow, which is another thing that really increases crop yields. And so the economy is becoming much more productive, and that helps create a sort of virtuous circle it means that the population can grow that little bit bigger. As population grows, they can expand onto new lands, creating more production, which leads to more population.
It's interesting because, we tend to think, we'll talk about feudalism because certainly we're getting into the era of sort of classical feudalism, high feudalism, whatever you want to call it. But that 843 treaty, the Treaty of Verdun that you mentioned, a lot of people argue that this is sort of the formation of modern Europe, and we're seeing the division between Germany and France and Italy, and there's lots to unpack there, and we can talk about it. But the other thing that I think is worth remembering is, we're only in 987, we're only 6-7 generations from the fall of the Western Roman Empire. We're closer to that in time, to the Black Death, going forward. So we have a long way to go. But yeah, it's about sort of this midway point here. So it is, we have to dispel sort of modern notions of when we think about political power. I think that we have this tendency to see, and Game of Thrones maybe have done some good here to show that, there's no such thing necessarily as absolute power in the medieval period. The king doesn't get to do everything they want to do. Certainly if they have the biggest army in the region, they can. But by and large, this is rule with the magnates of the realm, with the peers. And that's something that I think we'll talk about in a little bit. And that kind of segues into the next question that I have is kind of about the Robertians, the line from which Hugh Capet descends, because they're not necessarily the ruling family of France. And by the way, I'm going to use the word France for convenience purposes here. Because I don't want to get into the machinations
that's fine.
What else we're going to call this. We're just going to call it France. So
I do
wonder
it
if you
too.
start by talking about who were the Robertians and what was Hugh Capet's relationship to that, because that really starts to explain how he comes to power and kicks this dynasty off.
Yeah. Okay. So that's an interesting thing to get into. So I just want to be really clear here for listeners. The Robertians and the Capetians are the same dynasty. We talk about them, we give them different names because Hugh Capet starts an unbroken line of kings that are going to reign for 300 years. But Hugh Capet is a Robertian, and we could just as easily call the Capetians the Robertians. So his line is a princely line. There's a sort of later myth that arises about the Capetians that Hugh Capet was a usurper of low birth. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's a princely family. He was actually the fourth Robertian to sit on the throne of West Francia. So the other royal lines, so there are these two royal lines, in fact. The Robertians are one, the other is the Carolingians. And there's a sort of pro-Carolingian party that continues even after Hugh's election, that continues to kind of put forth this line that the Carolingians are the true kings of France. But like I said, Hugh was actually the fourth. So the Robertians, the relationship between the Robertians and the Carolingian families in West Francia, France, was competitive at times, but it could also be cooperative. And actually, Hugh is cousin to the second to last Carolingian king, because their mothers are actually sisters who are daughters of the German emperor, the Ottonian emperor. So this is a princely line. People are used to looking at the Robertians and going, these people could be kings. And they often just cooperate very closely with the Carolingians, often in a military way. What the Robertians are really, really good at is warfare. So the Carolingian kings like to have a Robertian by their side as a general, really.
Well, let's get to Hugh Capet then. Why is he elected? And once he is elected, what are sort of like the first challenges that he faces? Because this is still a challenging era for someone to come to power in by any stretch of the imagination.
Absolutely. Okay, so I want to just be clear on this election issue, because it sounds very modern to us, right? And in fact, we call it an election because the Latin term is electio, which we can translate as election. We could also translate it as a choice or a selection, and that's a little bit closer to what happened. So the situation was this. The last Carolingian king, a 20-year-old named Louis V, who had been on the throne for less than a year, about a year, had really upset a lot of people. He had particularly upset the German emperor, the Ottonian emperor, and who had a couple of very powerful churchmen on his side in France. So the archbishop of a city named Rhône, which is really important for ceremonial reasons, which we'll get into in a minute, and a monk by the name of Gerbert, who's going to end up being Pope Sylvester II. And these two guys are kind of machinating in the background, thinking Hugh Capet might be a better choice than sticking with Louis V, who is just a real nightmare and uncontrollable. But then Louis V dies in a hunting accident. And I don't think that there's any foul play here. I think he actually just did die, and it was a lucky break for the Archbishop of France and the Ottonian Emperor, and particularly for Hugh Capet. So the Archbishop of the great men, the great nobles and prelates of the realm are assembled together. And the Archbishop of France gives this speech about how Hugh Capet is very wealthy, very good at war. He's really distinguished himself in all the ways that we need in a king. And he says, a kingdom cannot be achieved through inheritance, which is not true, and he knows it's not true. But he says hereditary right alone doesn't do it. Hugh Capet is such a man of such great personal qualities that we should make him king. There is a rival. There is another claimant. The Louis V's uncle, a man named Charles of Lorraine, so the brother of the last Carolingian king but one. He says, I think I should be king. And the Archbishop of France says, no, you shouldn't be king. You're not as good as Hugh Capet. And by the way, you have married a woman really far beneath your station. So Charles of Lorraine is passed over, and Hugh is made king by acclamation. Charles of Lorraine is going to be, we talk about challenges. Charles of Lorraine is the main challenge for Hugh Capet, because by about a year after Hugh becomes king, Charles of Lorraine launches a rebellion. And he's got some important magnates on his side because, again, with that balance of power, a lot of those powerful people kind of look at Hugh and say, okay, now you are too powerful for our good. So it takes about 6 months to get Charles of Lorraine back in the box, actually literally back in the box. So what happens is Charles of Lorraine is captured, tricked into being captured, and Hugh Capet puts him in prison, and, well, we never hear from him again. So that's how he deals with that. And it does have a sort of unfortunate hangover for the Capetians, because then the story becomes that Hugh Capet is illegitimate. His election is illegitimate. He's stolen the throne. So that's not really true, but you can see where that story arises from. The other thing is he's got to secure the succession. So one of the first things he does, the this is even before Charles of Lorraine has launched his war, is he has his son, a man named Robert, who will later be known as Robert the Pious. He has Robert crowned as his associate king, his junior king. And this is something the Capetians are going to do for the next 100 years. They will crown their eldest son during their own lifetime, just to make clear who the succession belongs to afterwards. Is it an expression of weakness? Maybe. But it's also a fairly common thing for European monarchs to do. And he also tries to really cement Robert's position by having his chancellor write to Constantinople to see if he can get a Byzantine princess to come and marry Robert. And Constantinople does not reply, so Robert doesn't end up married to a Byzantine princess. But that's another way he's trying to make sure, okay, that after me, this goes to my son.
Yeah, legitimacy is an interesting thing in the medieval world. It is true that like a lot of European monarchs, and I mean, we can even go into the Arab world at the time, will sort of appoint their next successor in their lifetime. But you go back to the Carolingians that didn't practice primogeniture in all cases, and sort of had a tendency to divide things, as did other cultures, and that just didn't work very well. So, I mean, to an extent, perhaps this was them learning from the past a little bit. But you talk about the rebellion of Charles of Lorraine, and I want to talk a little bit about sort of the environment that Hugh Capet is coming into, because as listeners are probably aware, the medieval period is extremely violent period. This is certainly a might makes right, but into it steps this concept that I just love, the peace of God, and it's this idea that is so unique and interesting. And I was hoping you could explain, first of all, what is it? Where does it come from? Why did we need it?
Yeah.
Did it even work?
Uh-huh. Yeah. I adore the peace of God too. Historians have lots of fun fighting about the peace of God. Like, was it even a thing? I think it was a thing. So the peace of God, if we want to define it in the most basic way to get kind of down to brass tacks, the peace of God is actually a series of church councils. So great prelates, abbots, abbesses as well, coming together, sitting down and making church law. And these councils start in the 980s in central France, and then they sort of spread fitfully down into Aquitaine, into Catalonia, and into northern France as well. And what these councils try and do is they try and decree the protection of people that they tend to call the poor. Now, what they mean by that is not people who necessarily don't have any money, but people who are not strong. So women, clerics, merchants, and particularly peasants, people who work with plows, and people who are taking care of animals. And the way they try and guarantee that is by declaring that anyone who hurts those people is excommunicated. These are often really big meetings. So it's not just these prelates getting together, but often they have a really popular element as well. So you'll get big crowds coming and camping out in the fields. You'll get processions of relics. You'll get big sermons. And so there seems to be this really popular element to it that coincides with a wave of really religious revival across Western Europe. This is an age of church building. It's also really an apocalyptic age, and there's a sort of apocalyptic element to the peace movement where people are kind of expecting the second coming, either in the year 1000 or in the year 1033, because that's the year of the millennial anniversary of Christ's death, of course. So the idea is that society had become so violent and so disorganized that the church had to step in. And this is often reflected badly upon the early Capetian monarchs because, so the Carolingians could supposedly just kind of decree peace, and people would do that. And they had the same kind of religious ideas about the protection of the weak as we see in these later peace councils. So that doesn't come out of nowhere. But that's actually a bit simplistic because the Capetians are fully on board with this, particularly Robert the Pious. And the other thing to say there about that violence is it's not only coming from lay nobles. It is also coming from bishops who have their own armies and who have to swear oaths to keep the peace themselves. So it's a little bit more complex than the church steps in, where lay society failed to keep order. And there's also a bit to think about with violence and the prevalence of violence and what do we mean by violence, because a lot of our sources from this period are written by monks. And okay, that actually is the part of the church that doesn't tend to be violent. And so there's a sort of way in which they are talking about violence that is in their own self-interest to portray these other people and what they are doing as violent.
Yeah, I mean, this is the age of warrior bishops still. I mean, we're going to have popes leading armies through the Renaissance, at least one famous one. And so the flip side of the coin is feudalism. You know, West Francia, France is seen as sort of like the poster child for what we think of when we think of feudalism, right? And so I was hoping that we could talk about it for a couple minutes. What is feudalism? And the other thing that I always have a question about is, like, was it a good thing or a bad thing for Western Europe? You know, Normandy is, of course, the poster child for, well, we're going to give this chunk of land to the Northmen and they'll defend it from other Northmen, right? Because we're coming to the end of the Viking Age. So is that what we should think of when we think of feudalism, or was it much more small scale, and did it hinder statecraft, or was it something that was a sort of a necessary evil?
So many questions there. Okay, so most medieval historians don't like to talk about feudalism anymore. And a lot of people would just reject the term outright. And I think it's less about the term feudal than it is about the suffix ism, because that suffix gives a sense that there's some kind of system there's some kind of ideology, there's maybe even a right way to do it. And what we have on the ground is a much messier and more organic process than any kind of ism. And, you know, sort of classically, people think about the feudal pyramid, right? And in fact, we don't have that kind of hierarchy, even as an ideal. You know, you first kind of see it as an ideal in the 12th century, but it's an ideal. It's not at all what people are doing on the ground. And you don't really see that hierarchy really get formalized anywhere in France until the late 13th century. And even then, I can tell you stories, it's just a mess. Rather than a pyramid, think maybe about a spaghetti bowl of relationships, and you will be closer to the mark. So what we do have are some practices of power and social relations that we can put under kind of an umbrella term as being feudal. So we start to get lordship begins to become a lot more important in this period, and relationships of vassalage. So lords who have a reciprocal relationship with a man who holds a fief, a territory, or a castle from him, and owes him faith and does a ceremony of submission called homage. And that tie means that they owe each other things. And those relationships the proliferation of those relationships are related to and drive an ongoing proliferation of castles. So what we do see in the 11th century is a huge explosion of castles. And whereas what would happen in an earlier period is you would have fortresses, and those fortresses would be garrisoned, but they would belong to the lord in a certain sense. Now those castles are becoming heritable, and the soldiers who are garrisoning them are thinking of them as hereditary property and thinking of themselves as socially superior. So alongside with the proliferation of lords and vassals, we also get a change in the way people are thinking about knights. So the Latin word for knight is miles, which just means a soldier. And originally has a sort of unsavory sense to it. But over the course of the 11th century, the term miles begins to be honorable. And that is connected with the way that these castles are becoming heritable. It's connected with the way that they're being given out in these relationships of lordship and vassalage. But it's not a pyramid, and it's not systematic, and it's highly contested. There's a sense in which no one has any real clear idea of what's going on or whether it's a good thing. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? So we used to think about state building, estates in medieval Europe as a sort of U-shaped curve. So we start with the Carolingian Empire at the top of the U, and then there's this terrible fragmentation into castles and knights and violence and everything. We get to the bottom of the U, I don't know, sometime around 1050, and then we come up, and what happens is that the kings get control back, and they tell all the lords to go and behave themselves. But actually, lordship ends up very collaborative with kingship, and you can see it even in this period. So it's not that the king is saying, oh, Duke of Anjou, you shouldn't have your duchy and you should just do what I say. It's okay, we need to get together and collaborate because we have to work together in order to rule the kingdom. And that story continues even though power fragments further and you have smaller lordships. Even in the 14th century, the kings are working with the lords, not against them. At no point does a French king ever say, and let's just get rid of the lords. They're awful. They're a block to state building. They say, okay, lords, be part of this project. And the lords go, great. You know what that means? That means you can help us. It's really a win-win situation.
Yeah, and that kind of gets back to the idea we were talking about before of there is no such thing as sort of an absolute monarch in this period, because of course we're a long way away from gunpowder playing a major role on the battlefield, which is going to allow a lot of European monarchs later on to consolidate power in ways that make those castles a lot less useful to the lords and the castellans who have them. So you were talking about how, a lot of times there were competitions and so on and so forth. Well, let's get to, the end of Robert II, Hugh's successor. When we talk about competition, well, he produces 4 at least potential heirs. Normally, I guess you'd think, I suppose if you're someone like Henry VIII, well, this is a great thing, right? But it turns out that maybe it's not the best scenario in the world. So what happens near the end of his reign? But at the end, it's also important to point out, and I hope we can kind of turn back to this, that this doesn't result in dividing up the kingdom in a way that, the old Carolingian Empire was sort of formally divided. So talking about that and maybe why that doesn't happen here.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing about the Robertians and the Capetians. They're always quite clear on the idea of indivisibility and clear lines of succession. So, yes, Robert has 4 sons. His eldest, Hugh, he has crowned associate king, but he dies at the age of 18 in 1025. And he's already actually been kind of a problem because he's ready. He thinks, if you have teenagers, you will recognize the story, right? He's ready to rule on his own. He's ready for a piece of the kingdom. And Robert's just not giving him what he wants. But so he dies. And so Robert has 3 sons left. He has Henry, he has Robert, and then he has this 4th son named Odo, for whom no provision seems to be made whatsoever. Like, we know very little about Odo. He doesn't get any land. Like, he seems actually to make his living basically as a mercenary. Like, he shows up fighting in Normandy at one point, but we know very little about Odo. And that's actually quite interesting, the way he's a royal son, but nothing is done for him. So Henry and Robert. And what happens here is really interesting because it shows us some of the assumptions we take for granted later about succession are not yet in play. So Robert, the king, thinks that the next eldest son, Henry, should obviously be king. Robert's wife, the Queen Constance, with whom Robert has all kinds of conflicts, she does not agree. She thinks that the 3rd son, Robert, so named Robert a little bit confusingly, he should be king. And she has a lot of nobles on her side because people don't like Henry. They think he is, a lazy, weak-willed, and effeminate hypocrite. And Henry may actually be gay, interestingly, or at least bisexual, as far as we can tell. Maybe. There's a possibility there. In the end, one of the great nobles, the Count of Blois, really comes down on Henry's side, and that decides the matter. So Henry is crowned associate king, and Robert, to make him feel better, is given the Duchy of Burgundy. But again, King Robert doesn't hand over power the way his boys want. And it's a little bit like Eleanor of Aquitaine and the Devil's Brood prefigured, because what Constance does is she gets the boys together, Henry and Robert together, and says, let's go to war against Robert. And they say, yeah. And in the end, King Robert does have to back down a little bit more, give Henry more access to funds, let Robert have Burgundy, and he dies very soon thereafter. So, I think he probably died a fairly unhappy man.
That's saying something. I'm sure he envisioned the succession going in a very, very different way. But some of the things you were saying kind of gets me into my next question, which is, of course, in 1066, this relatively unknown guy named William of Normandy winds up being woefully successful in his conquest of England. Shocking. And this is, of course, going to be very important for Capetian France, because now we have a duke who owns this massive swath of territory on the other side of the English Channel. And so what were the implications? I mean, what did the Capetians think right away when, well, I don't know if we could say what they thought, but what was their response to, oh, okay, well, you're also the King of England now. This is important. We should talk about this.
Yeah. So actually, to back up a little bit, early on, the Normans were the Capetians' greatest cheerleaders. And actually, when William, who is at first known as the Bastard, because he was, inherits the duchy, he's like 8 years old. And so the Capetian king, Henry, is like his guardian. And they work together very closely. But as William grows up, he sort of shrugs off Henry's tutelage and actually becomes a real threat, and forces Henry to change his alliances and ally with the Duke of Anjou instead. When William invades Normandy, the King of France is actually a minor. So Henry has died, and this new king, Philip, is on the throne. William does not attend Philip's coronation, which is interesting. And there is a real sense that William feels he is now the French king's equal. He is still their vassal for Normandy. And this will continue to cause problems. And then even later in the 100 Years' War, the English kings no longer have Normandy, but they do have part of Aquitaine. So that double identity as a sovereign king in your own right in England, but a vassal of the French king, it's very distasteful to the English kings. And they really, really do not like doing homage to the French kings. If they can possibly get out of it, they do. So there is that aspect of it. Are we now equal? The other thing is it means, yes, those resources, English resources, it means that the King of England, as Duke of Normandy, is incredibly rich. And of course, he has all this land with which to reward his followers, and not just to reward his warrior followers, but also to grease the wheels with the church, right? With big donations, and here you can be abbot, right? So William has a lot of gifts to give. And if we think about the medieval political economy sort of running on patronage, William is now able to be a patron to a much greater extent than the French kings are. And this is particularly problematic geopolitically because Normandy is really close to the French king's heartlands. It's like a day's ride from Paris, right? So they're right there. And the border is just very, very contested.
Yeah, and listeners to the show will certainly remember that this is sort of an ongoing problematic issue, certainly through the 100 Years' War. But Richard the First, the Lionheart, he's going to go back and forth. They're going to go back and forth over the series of castles that are on this borderland that are crucial to both kingdoms because they are such a close striking distance from Paris and from really that central heart of France. And it all starts to get going here during the Capetian. But of course, there's this huge second key event that happens at the tail end of the 11th century, and that is in 1095, Pope Urban II calls this thing, they're not going to call it a crusade yet, but anachronistically later on, we're going to call it the First Crusade. Okay, interesting. So what was the relationship like between the then Capetian king, who I believe is Philip I, and the church? And what did they think about the crusade? What part did they play in it? Because, of course, the Capetian king's not going to go on the First Crusade. We're not going to get a king on the crusade for a bit yet, but it's coming. But, what did they think about it? Was this something that they knew about? Was this something that was?
Yeah.
Was it, where are we going with this one here?
Well, Philip certainly knew about the Council of Clermont because it was partly called in order to excommunicate him for adultery. So in 1095, Philip I has run off with the Count of Anjou's wife, which means he has also illegally divorced his own wife. So this has gotten him into incredibly hot water with the church, and also with his subjects, who also think this is terrible. It also means that he has just destroyed all of his alliances because he needed Anjou against Normandy, and his ex-wife was the half-sister of the Count of Flanders, so he's also lost Flanders. So Philip is in a terrible position for the Council of Clermont, which is partially called to deal with the problem of the king's adultery. It's also a peace council. So one of the things that happens at it is more peace measures are decreed. And at this point, there are sort of time limitations. So there's not going to be any violence between Thursday and Sunday and that sort of thing. But also at Clermont, the Pope Urban II preaches this sermon. It is a sermon. We do not know what the words exactly were, because we only have reports afterwards. But we know it was an incredibly moving sermon. Now, Pope Urban II had been approached by the Byzantine emperor for help against the Seljuk Turks, who had been attacking Anatolia, had been attacking the Byzantine Empire. And we think that probably what the Byzantine emperor wanted was some well-trained mercenaries. But what Urban's speech set in motion, and we do think that he meant to do this, was a massive armed pilgrimage to take back Jerusalem. And they actually succeed in doing that amazingly in 1099. Philip I can't go. And we say, okay, as you said, kings don't go on the First Crusade. But Philip couldn't have gone because he was excommunicated. The English king, William Rufus, couldn't go, well, one, because Philip isn't going, so William Rufus isn't going. And he also has problems of his own to worry about. But Philip's younger brother goes. Unfortunately for him, and really kind of for the Capetians' reputation, he leaves when the going gets tough and doesn't stick around for Jerusalem. So the people who actually get the glory in the First Crusade are actually some lesser lords. So the Count of Toulouse is there, but actually there are a lot of these smaller lords who only hold a few castles. We call them castellans, who bring back enormous glory for the First Crusade. And there is a sense in which the Capetians feel a little bit overshadowed.
I want to ask one quick follow-up question to that, because I've always wondered on this. This was sort of given to me back years ago when I was a student. This was given as sort of the rationale, or part of the rationale for the First Crusade. I've never known if there's any truth to it, which is, the Pope takes a look around Western Europe and says, there are too many guys with swords. We have got to get some of them the heck out of Western Europe. So I'm going to tell them to go take back Jerusalem, not controlled by the Seljuk Turks, by the way, controlled actually by the Fatimids of Egypt. But it is And he says, get up, go take Jerusalem, go take all your weapons, go take all your stuff, go fight them. Stop fighting each other. Is there any truth to that whatsoever? Was that an idea?
Yeah, I mean there is truth to the idea that the crusade is sort of a peace measure, right? Clermont is a peace council, and yes, that these Christians should not be fighting one another. Why are you wasting your blood? Why are you sinning in this way when you could be taking this violence against someone who, and at those days, and in those terms, sort of deserves it. So yeah, I mean that is absolutely an argument, and it's an argument we'll see going forward too. Again, in the 100 Years' War, if we look forward, one of the reasons everybody wants to stop the 100 Years' War is so that then France and England can go off and fight the Ottomans.
Yeah, you're right. That's going to be kind of this on again, off again. We're going to try to get peace to this. Not that there weren't plenty of people to fight all over the place if they wanted to, but I wanted to ask. We're getting close to time here, but you mentioned specifically that Louis VI, Louis the Fat, is also who's going to be the descendant of Philip, I believe. He's a knight as well, and I'm always curious. Like, is sort of the Capetian dynasty? Is this sort of like what the time period we should think of when we think of chivalry? Is this sort of the heart of this sort of romantic knight culture? Does that finally start to develop during this time period? And is it sort of inexorably tied to the ideas of feudalism, or is it in some way separate?
This is absolutely the beginning of chivalry, the beginning of knighthood as an honorable profession, the beginning of a sort of aristocratic culture surrounding knighthood, the beginning of chivalric literature. It's at the end of the 11th century that the Song of Rône comes into being. Yeah, it's the beginning of that age. I tend to think of the real height of chivalry actually being sort of the 14th and 15th century, even though that's at that point a sort of nostalgic movement, but it is more articulated cultural phenomenon. Whereas at the end of the 11th and into the 12th century, that's really still developing.
Yeah, I certainly think that there's a big difference between, during what period is the knight sort of like the optimal fighting unit on the field, and during what time period is chivalry as an ideal, sort of a dominant mode of thinking for at least certain members of society. And those two things don't necessarily have to be the same. But we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask one last question if I could. And that was, you write in the book about the Capetian ability to sort of make people, to get good leaders and put them in positions where they need to be, and I wondered if you had any examples of that, and if we could, I hate to do this, but to sort of project out to even sort of the modern day of like, what does this tell us about sort of the nature of leadership when things were done on such a personal level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, particularly the later Capetians are really good at choosing their counselors and choosing their administrators, and particularly choosing lawyers who are going to make the case for royal power, and extend royal power in ways it wasn't before. But I also think of Capetian kingship and Capetian queenship as being very personally driven. So it mattered a lot who the king was and what his relationships were like. So if you get people who work together really well, like Louis VIII and his queen Blanche of Castile, and then Blanche of Castile is a very efficient and clever regent for her young son, Louis IX, who becomes St. Louis, San Louis. Then the monarchy really prospers, and the kingdom really prospers. And if you get a bad king, like Philip I, sometimes that goes in the other direction. And I do think that is to some extent true today. I think that personality in our political system of democratic elections matters, even more. In the Middle Ages, you kind of got what you got, and now we have to kind of like our politicians in order for them to get anywhere, which wasn't necessarily the case in the Middle Ages. But people's relationships do still matter a lot, and what their life stories matter a lot. I was thinking about Abraham Lincoln losing his son and his disastrous marriage, and what effect that had on his presidency. So yeah, I think these personal stories do still matter a lot in terms of leadership today.
I think it's one of the things that I always will enjoy about medieval history, in that we don't necessarily know everything. We don't know how certain day-to-day events may have impacted the leaders who lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago, just because we don't have the records, not because they weren't impacted by anything. And I think that's something that makes this time period so enticing to me and so interesting, in that we kind of do have to fill in the gaps at times. And there are times that we have really good source material, but there are other times when certainly we don't have anything, maybe for a given region on a given year. So this has been great. Now, I always ask, we obviously didn't cover everything. We didn't cover even close to everything in the book, but is there any glaring thing that we missed that people really need to know about?
Okay, one thing I think that people really need to know about, we've been talking about a lot how France in 987 does not look like France in 1300, let alone in 1700. One thing that I think a lot of people might find very surprising is how much more superstitious and persecutory France becomes in the 14th century than it was earlier on. We tend to have this kind of teleological idea that people get more and more logical as time goes on, and it's really not. At the turn of the 14th century, people start thinking that there are kind of necromancers everywhere, that there are sorcerers, that oh goodness, there's this whole conspiracy theory that the Jews and the lepers have gotten together to poison the French king and the French people at the behest of the Sultan of Cairo. And people believe this and actually go out and kill Jews and lepers. And people will say, oh, that sounds so medieval. Okay, it's so 14th century. It is not at all so 12th century or so 11th century, right? So I think that's a really interesting thing, that, history does not move all in one direction. And it's not getting better all the time.
No, I tell students all the time, history is not linear. It just simply isn't. It's not a linear progress from point A to point B. And I think even when I was studying the early Middle Ages, one of the things that shocked me is that, to some extent, the early Middle Ages is more pluralistic than the late Middle Ages. And even though it's separated by several hundreds of years, and you would think, well, certainly it's gotten better by then. But I mean, a lot of it, unfortunately, sounds like some of the conspiracy theories that you hear today. So I guess maybe we today have more in common with 14th century, again, air quotes, France, than we do with 10th century France, at least in that information regard. Not that that's necessarily a good thing, but well, this has been lovely. It's a wonderful book, and I'm sure it's going to do very well. And anybody who is interested in medieval history, or who thinks they might be interested in medieval history, pick it up before the Olympics, by the way, which are in Paris. So you can give you a really long view of how things
There's
are.
a lot in there about Paris. So, yeah, definitely. If you're a fan of Paris, you will like this book.
Completely agree with you. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We've really appreciated the chat.
Yeah, it's been really fun. Thanks for having me.